let's talk about another dinosaur, the Irritator Dinosaur. And yes, genuinely, that's its real name. We'll get into that. This is the Irritator challengeri, or more commonly known as the Irritator. It's a type of Spinosaurus dinosaur that lived in Brazil in the early Cretaceous around 110 million years ago. And this dinosaur kind of does have a wild history. It's known from a skull specimen discovered, which is the holotype for the species. However, there was a lot of stuff that happened with said skull. Based on the skull shape and structure, it was actually initially thought to be a pterosaur, and then later a maniraptor. However, further evidence shows that it is in fact a Spinosaurus. This confusion was due to the fact that the holotype specimen skull was actually incredibly damaged, and that's also where the name the Irritator comes from, because apparently, the scientists working with the skull were so annoyed by its damaged condition that they named it after the irritation that they felt working with that specimen. A direct quote from the authors of the paper working with the dinosaur, the name Irritator came from irritation, the feeling these authors felt brackets, understated here, when discovering that the snout had been artificially elongated. These scientists were pissed off, man. Now, most likely the skull was very heavily damaged during the collection process. It was collected from a chalk concretion in Brazil by dealers and fossil hunters, not actual certified paleontologists. So the dealers kind of very, very poorly excavated the skull of the Irritator, and then they sold it and got it to actual paleontologists who studied it and were like, what the fuck is this? The skull was so heavily damaged, it looked quite a lot longer than it was initially, so much so that the scientists actually thought that it was a pterosaur beak, which evidently is not the case, but that just goes to show how, fucked to hell and back this skull was. Which, to be honest, is a little bit unfair to the dinosaur. It wasn't her fault that her skull got smashed by shitty collectors, but it is still a funny story nonetheless. And speaking of the dinosaur itself, it likely was a somewhat aquatic dinosaur living around riverbanks and in swamps and eating kind of fish and other reptiles and whatever it could catch, largely a similar diet to modern crocodiles. It's also one of the smallest of the Spinosaur species that we've discovered thus far. They were likely more solitary predators, feeding again largely on fish and other aquatic life, and they went extinct around the end of the early Cretaceous. They really were quite a cool dinosaur with a kind of hilarious and a little bit mean name.